She called me in a panic from the hotel lobby, her voice sharp but calculated. "Emily, you need to get here now, it's urgent." I paused mid-step, the suitcase handle cold in my hand, a familiar unease creeping into my chest. "Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and at the end don't forget to rate the story from 0 to 10, enjoy the story." The flight had been smooth, the hotel room pristine, the city skyline glittering against the late afternoon sun, all set for our anniversary retreat that Jack and I had meticulously planned for months. The calendar on my phone reminded me of reservations for dinner, the spa, and the little boat tour we had booked on Lake Morrison, each one a marker of what should have been a carefree celebration. Yet now, everything twisted instantly with that single call. I dropped my keys onto the polished console, glanced at Jack, whose brow furrowed slightly, sensing my hesitation but not yet knowing the cause. "It's Margaret," I said quietly, my voice steady, concealing the spike of irritation under calm. He nodded, not questioning, trusting me to interpret the nuance. As we drove through the city streets, the hospital's familiar red brick facade loomed ahead, and I could feel the weight of anticipation, suspicion, and the faint thrill of control beneath the surface of my composure. The receptionist's smile faltered when she saw me, a subtle recognition of my routine presence, yet nothing more. I moved with precision, arms folded lightly, steps measured. The scent of antiseptic hung in the air, sterile and unnerving. Margaret was there, seated on a wheelchair she did not need, a blanket draped over her shoulders, hands clasped in her lap with meticulous care to appear frail. Her eyes flicked to Jack, then me, calculating, assessing, gauging the impact of her performance. I allowed a measured pause, letting the tension swell, the silence speaking louder than any accusation I might have voiced. I noticed the subtle tremor in her grip, the faint crease of impatience on her forehead, details she believed hidden beneath the mask she wore. I drew a slow breath, observing, noting. The nurses buzzed around us, carrying charts, checking vitals, exchanging glances that I barely acknowledged but whose nuances I registered fully. I smiled lightly, almost imperceptibly, as though confirming my mastery of the room and situation without saying a word. Jack hovered slightly behind me, silent but attuned to my lead, ready to support yet trusting my judgment entirely. The moment stretched taut with unspoken challenge, a dance of appearances and control. I leaned forward subtly, hands on the wheelchair handles, and spoke softly, even to Margaret, "Shall we get this checked properly?" My tone carried authority cloaked in civility, measured patience wrapped around observation. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, eyes darting for validation that would not come from me, her performance under the scrutiny of professionals I knew well, who already sensed discrepancies in her behavior. I allowed the pause to linger, letting her internal dissonance accumulate while I maintained a calm, unshakable exterior. The room's fluorescent lights cast sharp angles on the linoleum floor, reflecting off the polished surfaces in ways that emphasized the gravity of the moment without theatrics. I guided her, slowly, deliberately, through the motions of being examined, each step a silent assertion that her manipulation was transparent, that the script she intended to enact was already failing under the weight of careful observation. And as the doctor entered, nodding at me with a quiet, knowing glance, I realized that the stage she believed she had set for humiliation and chaos was already shifting beneath her feet, the real power lying in poise, awareness, and the calm assertion of truth. The waiting area was quiet, almost unbearably so, the low hum of fluorescent lights mingling with the occasional paging over the intercom. I adjusted my coat, smoothing the fabric with meticulous care, as if the act itself could steady the pulse that tickled the edges of my awareness. Jack stood beside me, hands in his pockets, scanning the room with polite curiosity while leaving me to lead the moment. I focused on the details around me, the soft squeak of the rolling chairs, the faint scent of antiseptic mingling with the sharp tang of coffee from the nearby vending machine, the way the linoleum reflected the overhead light in muted angles. Margaret shifted slightly in her seat, attempting to maintain an air of fragility, a hand pressed lightly over her chest as though to convince herself of the narrative she had constructed. I watched her carefully, noting each minute gesture, each micro-expression that betrayed the story she was trying to sell. A nurse approached, clipboard in hand, and exchanged a few murmured words with the receptionist before pausing to look at me, recognition in her eyes but no judgment, simply awareness. I nodded, acknowledging the subtle alliance of observation, the quiet understanding that would tip the scales in subtle, unseen ways. Jack shifted his weight, glancing at me as though seeking confirmation, and I simply inclined my head, signaling patience, control, and readiness. We moved deliberately, a measured procession to the examination room, each step calculated, each glance purposeful. I spoke to Margaret softly, almost conversationally, yet the undertone carried unspoken authority, "We will take this one step at a time." Her eyes flicked to mine briefly, a flash of annoyance or fear, it was hard to tell, but it was there. I felt a faint, satisfying tightening in my chest, the awareness that I held the narrative without raising my voice, without dramatics, without confrontation. The room filled slowly, the professionals going about their tasks, yet their attention occasionally grazing Margaret, registering small inconsistencies, subtle pauses, a hesitancy in her movements that I did not need to point out. I remained calm, my gestures minimal, my breathing steady, and yet each small movement of mine seemed to stretch the moment, to magnify the tension without a single word of accusation. I observed the rhythm of the room, the ebb and flow of activity around us, letting each detail accumulate into a broader understanding of the landscape of control and perception. Margaret attempted to engage with the staff, her voice polite but strained, trying to anchor her story, to guide them into believing her performance. I mirrored her motions outwardly, a step behind in appearance but fully in command internally, letting the room and the professional staff draw conclusions while I maintained a composed exterior. The watch on my wrist caught the light, a reminder of the schedules, the dinner reservations, the carefully orchestrated itinerary of our trip that had been interrupted by this manipulation, and yet I felt no rush, no panic. Every measured step, every deliberate pause, every subtle glance built a framework within which Margaret's story began to unravel silently. Jack remained observant but unspoken, a witness to my composure, understanding instinctively that this was not about confrontation, but about quiet revelation, the unfolding of truth without dramatics, the soft, undeniable assertion of presence, clarity, and control. As we navigated through the tasks of the examination, I allowed Margaret to believe she had set the pace, only to notice each slip, each hesitation, each unguarded flicker of expression, reinforcing the quiet knowledge that patience and observation often outweigh the loudest claims. The doctor stepped closer, his expression calm, professional, yet carrying a subtle acknowledgement of the tension in the room. I followed each movement, hands resting lightly on the wheelchair handles, observing Margaret as she attempted to maintain the illusion of frailty. Every flicker of her eyes, every pause in her speech, betrayed her careful construction. Jack remained close, his posture relaxed but attentive, aware of the silent signals I was sending, trusting my judgment completely. I noticed the clipboard in the nurse's hand, the subtle notation of irregularities that she did not yet voice, yet I understood the quiet significance behind each mark. The fluorescent lighting highlighted the small beads of perspiration at the corners of Margaret's eyes, the faint tremor in her fingers, the way she adjusted the blanket repeatedly, almost ritualistically. I mirrored her outward movements, a step behind, an impression of compliance, but inwardly analyzing, cataloging, and planning each response. The waiting stretched, the minutes ticking slowly against the sterile tiles of the floor, and I allowed Margaret to feel the weight of observation pressing in, the subtle pressure of scrutiny without accusation. Jack's eyes followed mine, reading the cues that would dictate how we navigated the next moments. I let my gaze drift momentarily to the window, the late afternoon light casting soft shadows, the city outside continuing unremarkably as if nothing unusual were occurring, a stark contrast to the carefully orchestrated drama unfolding inside. I spoke softly to Margaret, neutral tones, measured cadence, "We will make sure everything is properly recorded." Her lips pressed into a thin line, a micro-expression of frustration or concern that she did not acknowledge aloud. The nurse glanced up at me briefly, a flicker of understanding in her expression, then returned to her notes, the subtle communication carrying more weight than words. I took another measured step, guiding the wheelchair slightly forward, allowing Margaret to believe she was leading the interaction, while every detail was under my quiet control. Each action she attempted to perform, each gesture meant to convey weakness or urgency, was catalogued, observed, and stored, a record that would inform the next phase of our careful response. The air was tinged with the faint scent of antiseptic, mingling with the subtle warmth from the sunlight filtering through the blinds, a sensory backdrop to the unfolding psychological tension. I felt a calm certainty settle in, the understanding that the situation, while designed to unsettle me, was entirely manageable through patience, observation, and composed action. Margaret's attempts at subtle manipulation were transparent to me now, the cracks in her narrative exposed by the quiet authority of my presence, the attention of trained professionals who unknowingly sided with clarity over performance, and the silent alignment of Jack at my side, reinforcing the strength of our measured response in the midst of her theatrics. The room was quiet except for the occasional shuffle of papers and the soft murmur of staff speaking to one another. I guided Margaret to a chair near the examination table, observing each movement, each subtle gesture. That betrayed the act she was trying to maintain. Jack stayed close, his eyes scanning the environment, but he deferred to my lead, understanding that the careful orchestration of presence and perception was mine to manage. I took in the details around us. The pale blue of the hospital walls, the muted hum of the air conditioning, the faint scent of antiseptic that seemed to linger in the corners of the room, and the gentle tapping of shoes against the tile. Margaret attempted to shift the narrative, her voice soft, strained, trying to inject urgency into the scenario. I listened without reacting overtly, letting her words hang in the air, each one undermined by the inconsistencies visible in her posture and expression. The nurse glanced at me briefly, an almost imperceptible nod acknowledging my calm presence, and returned to her duties. I allowed my eyes to wander, noting the reflection of the window blinds on the linoleum floor, the way the light shifted subtly across the room, and the small details that revealed the rhythm of the space. Margaret adjusted the blanket over her lap again, a small frown crossing her forehead, the faintest hint of impatience, or perhaps anxiety. I leaned slightly forward, hands resting lightly on the arms of the wheelchair, speaking softly, deliberately, without accusation, "Let us make sure everything is clear." Her lips pressed together, a momentary pause that gave away her discomfort, a silent acknowledgement of the scrutiny she was under. Jack shifted slightly behind me, the quiet support evident in his stance, but I was fully aware of the dynamics in play. Every glance, every slight twitch, every hesitation in Margaret's act became a point of observation, a record of control and subtle revelation. The doctor entered the room, clipboard in hand, eyes moving first to me, then to Margaret, taking in the scene with professional calm. I allowed a slow exhale, a measure of satisfaction at the balance of power quietly asserting itself. Margaret's performance wavered under the collective attention, the illusion of urgency losing ground to the clarity and patience that filled the room. I moved through the motions with precision, guiding the process, letting the environment and those around me reinforce the quiet authority I maintained. Each step, each subtle interaction, was an assertion that observation, calm, and measured action could dismantle the artifice without confrontation, that control could be exerted with presence rather than words, and that the truth, when met with patient and steady eyes, revealed itself naturally. The subtle shift in the atmosphere became noticeable as the staff moved through their routines with deliberate calm, their professional composure highlighting the contrast with the tension Margaret tried to maintain. I kept my posture composed, one hand lightly resting on the wheelchair, the other gesturing minimally, allowing the space and the flow of activity to reinforce the quiet control I exercised. Jack observed from a respectful distance, attuned to every small cue I projected, understanding that patience and measured presence were far more powerful than immediate confrontation. I watched Margaret attempt to engage with the nurses, her voice polite yet tinged with urgency that did not match her measured movements, a discrepancy that the professionals around us seemed to detect unconsciously. I remained silent, letting the inconsistencies accumulate like a pattern forming under careful scrutiny, each small act of hers observed and mentally catalogued. The fluorescent lights above cast a soft glare across the tiled floor, bouncing off the edges of the wheelchair and the clipboard the doctor held, creating a visual rhythm that mirrored the controlled pacing of the unfolding events. I noticed the slight hesitation in Margaret's expressions when a nurse asked a routine question, the momentary flicker of doubt she attempted to mask, and the subtle tightening of her hands around the blanket. Each of these details informed the understanding I had built in the prior minutes, a silent narrative of observation that required no overt reaction to validate. Jack's presence behind me was grounding, yet I did not need to rely on it. The environment itself, the staff, the careful sequence of their actions, and the quiet evidence of Margaret's performance, all contributed to the equilibrium I maintained. I allowed my gaze to sweep across the room, noting the minute motions of people moving, the sounds of shoes tapping lightly against the linoleum, the soft murmur of conversation carried in controlled tones, all elements that shaped the backdrop for the subtle tension I managed. Margaret's attempts to influence the proceedings became increasingly transparent as I maintained measured stillness, each of her gestures and utterances carefully weighed against the visible and invisible cues that surrounded us. I adjusted the wheelchair slightly, a minimal, deliberate movement that asserted control without a word, signaling that the rhythm of the encounter was mine to guide. The room remained calm, orderly, and yet every micro-detail, from the soft rustling of papers to the tilt of Margaret's head, was an element in the unfolding narrative of quiet revelation. I allowed the minutes to stretch, maintaining a steady breathing pattern, watching the small cracks in her act grow under observation, knowing that the careful accumulation of these details would speak louder than any immediate verbal confrontation. The balance of awareness, patience, and subtle authority created a framework where the truth, fully visible to those paying attention, revealed itself in a controlled, silent crescendo of understanding. The subtle tension in the room began to shift as the staff completed their routine checks, moving with quiet efficiency, unaware of the deeper currents at play. I guided Margaret toward a chair near the window, the late afternoon light casting muted shadows across the floor, emphasizing the stillness of the space. Each step I took was measured, deliberate, a silent assertion of control that required no words to communicate. Jack remained close, his presence unobtrusive yet grounding, understanding that observation and patience were our tools. I watched Margaret adjust her blanket, her movements precise but revealing small signs of unease, the faint tightening of her jaw, the barely perceptible fidgeting of her fingers. The nurses exchanged brief, professional glances, noting the usual details of a routine visit, but their inadvertent attention added weight to the subtle dissonance in Margaret's performance. I maintained a steady, calm demeanor, allowing the quiet authority of measured presence to dominate the room. Each glance, each micro-expression, every hesitant gesture by Margaret became a data point, a small confirmation that her story was fragile under scrutiny. I tilted my head slightly, acknowledging a nurse with a soft nod, reinforcing the silent alignment between observation and truth. Jack's gaze shifted between us, attentive, absorbing the nuances of timing and gesture, yet I did not need to direct him. The rhythm of the room dictated the course, and I followed it with composed intent. Margaret attempted to engage in conversation, her tone polite but carrying a subtle strain, an attempt to assert urgency that was not matched by her measured movements. I allowed her to speak, letting the words hang in the air, knowing that the inconsistencies would speak for themselves to those watching. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the faint echo of distant footsteps created a backdrop for the quiet unfolding of events. I adjusted the wheelchair slightly, a small, deliberate movement that reminded Margaret of my presence without confrontation, signaling that the dynamics were under my control. Each professional in the room continued their duties, inadvertently supporting the framework of observation and clarity that I maintained. The late afternoon sun shifted through the blinds, drawing patterns across the linoleum, mirroring the careful alignment of patience, awareness, and subtle authority I projected. Margaret's attempts to maintain her narrative became increasingly fragile, her gestures less confident, her voice quieter, more tentative. I let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of observation and the quiet accumulation of evidence to unfold naturally. Jack's posture remained calm, an anchor to the situation, but I led the interaction with unspoken precision, confident in the balance of authority, patience, and composure that would ensure the truth emerged without confrontation. The room, orderly and professional, reflected back the quiet power of controlled presence, the accumulation of details, and the measured pacing of observation that left no space for deception to persist unnoticed. I guided Margaret through the final steps of the examination, each motion deliberate, composed, measured, allowing the room to settle into a rhythm dictated by observation and quiet authority. Jack followed closely, his posture calm, supportive yet non-intrusive, understanding that the unfolding situation required patience and silent evaluation rather than confrontation. I observed every micro-expression, every subtle hesitation, every flicker of imbalance in Margaret's performance, cataloging them as evidence without uttering a word. The nurse moved between us, carrying charts and checking the vitals with practiced ease, occasionally glancing toward me as though sensing the tension that I held in careful balance. The fluorescent lights reflected softly on the polished floor, highlighting the subtle movements of the wheelchair and the edges of the clipboard, creating a visual cadence that mirrored the controlled pace of the interaction. Margaret attempted to interject with small comments, her voice polite but strained, attempting to convey urgency that did not match the precision of her actions. I allowed her to continue, letting the inconsistencies accumulate, each one reinforcing the reality that the narrative she attempted to construct was fragile under careful observation. Jack's eyes followed mine, absorbing the flow, the timing, the subtle shifts in body language, ready to respond if necessary, but understanding that the strength of patience and calm was our most effective tool. I adjusted the wheelchair slightly, a measured movement that asserted control without confrontation, reinforcing the quiet dominance of careful presence. The room felt expansive yet intimate, every sound, every flicker of movement, every glance contributing to the undercurrent of awareness and authority that I maintained. Margaret's attempts to influence the staff became increasingly transparent, her gestures less confident, her tone more tentative. I let the moment stretch, allowing the silence, the observation, and the accumulation of evidence to speak for themselves. The professionals continued their work, unaware that their routine actions were reinforcing the clarity and composure I projected. Each step, each small adjustment, each pause, created an environment where truth surfaced naturally, where performance faltered under patient scrutiny, and where quiet, controlled observation demonstrated power without words. The late afternoon light shifted across the room, the shadows moving slowly over surfaces, echoing the unspoken cadence of control and awareness that defined the space. I remained composed, hands lightly resting on the wheelchair handles, breathing steady, eyes attentive, maintaining a presence that allowed the truth to emerge fully and naturally, while Jack stood in quiet support, understanding instinctively that the strength of measured calm outweighed any overt reaction, and that the final impression of authority and insight was conveyed through observation, patience, and the subtle orchestration of presence. The tension finally began to release as the staff completed the last checks, their routine movements returning the room to a calm, steady rhythm. I guided Margaret toward the exit, each motion measured, deliberate, ensuring that the framework of observation remained intact until the very last moment. Jack followed, close but unobtrusive, eyes scanning, alert to subtle cues, yet fully trusting my lead. I observed Margaret's posture, the way she adjusted her clothing, the slight hesitation in her steps, all small signals of the unraveling story she had tried to control. The sunlight through the blinds painted shifting patterns on the tile, a soft illumination that underscored the quiet authority I held without uttering a word. Margaret attempted a smile, tight and careful, her eyes darting toward the staff, perhaps seeking validation, perhaps hoping her narrative still held sway, but the subtle tension in her gestures revealed the truth she could not mask. I remained composed, steady in breath and movement, allowing each action to reinforce the sense of calm control and clarity that had guided the encounter from the start. Jack mirrored my cadence, silent acknowledgement of the unspoken plan and the steady resolution that now defined our interaction. I let the silence stretch between us and Margaret, the subtle accumulation of observed inconsistencies, the patient and quiet scrutiny, all forming an invisible narrative of awareness and measured power. The staff moved efficiently, their attention focused on routine duties, yet each motion underscored the controlled environment we maintained, the natural alignment of observation and authority without confrontation. I shifted the wheelchair slightly, guiding her through the doorway, a minimal movement that reinforced the structure of the space, the flow of presence and oversight. Margaret's attempts to reclaim composure were increasingly strained, each subtle gesture less assured, her voice more tentative as the realization of her unraveling performance settled quietly over her. I maintained steady eye contact when necessary, soft but firm, communicating presence without escalation, the power of observation evident in the careful pacing of my actions. Jack followed the rhythm, attuned to every nuance, silent witness to the unfolding clarity. The room, the light, the soft sounds, all became part of the controlled cadence that allowed the truth to emerge naturally, the tension resolving not with confrontation but with measured, deliberate, and quiet assertion. As we reached the elevator, I felt a sense of calm completion, the careful orchestration of patience, observation, and composed presence having revealed the reality in full, leaving Margaret with the silent weight of recognition, and Jack and I carrying forward the quiet confidence of truth handled with precision, dignity, and unwavering composure. As we exited the hospital, the late afternoon sunlight warmed the sidewalk, the city moving around us with its usual calm, unaware of the subtle victory that had unfolded within those walls. I guided Margaret to a taxi, her posture slightly more rigid, the performance she had attempted now softened by the quiet clarity of observation and patient attention. Jack walked beside me, his hand lightly brushing mine, a silent acknowledgement of the shared understanding that this moment had been managed with composure, rather than confrontation. I noted the reflection of the sunlight on the car windows, the muted colors of passing buildings, the faint sounds of distant traffic, all blending into a steady rhythm that underscored the resolution of the encounter. Margaret attempted a small, polite comment, her tone measured, but the slight hesitation betrayed an awareness that her narrative had lost its force, the careful construction she relied upon no longer convincing. I listened silently, allowing the unspoken weight of the previous hours to assert itself, the quiet power of observation having revealed what words alone could not. Jack and I stepped back as the taxi driver closed the door, the vehicle a subtle barrier between performance and reality, a physical marker of the transition from tense scrutiny to calm clarity. The remainder of our walk toward the hotel was measured, deliberate, each step a continuation of the rhythm we had maintained throughout the ordeal. I allowed myself a quiet glance at Jack, the shared understanding reflected in his eyes, the subtle acknowledgement that patience and measured action had prevailed. The light shifted across the pavement, elongating shadows, creating a visual echo of the deliberate cadence of our movements, reinforcing the control and composure that had guided each step. Margaret's presence in the rearview mirror was a reminder of the delicate balance of appearances and truth, a reflection of the effort expended to manipulate perception now softened by subtle exposure and quiet attention. I took a slow breath, noting the calm in the space around us, the sense of completion that arose not from confrontation but from careful, deliberate observation and composed action. Jack matched my pace, silent, attuned, aware that the integrity of the experience had been maintained through quiet, deliberate presence. The taxi pulled away, the sunlight glinting off its polished surface, and we continued along the sidewalk, the city stretching ahead, normal, unhurried, the earlier tension replaced by a calm assurance that the truth had been fully revealed and quietly asserted. Every small detail, the tilt of a head, the pattern of light, the sound of footsteps on pavement, contributed to the quiet conclusion, a testament to the strength of measured presence, patience, and controlled observation in guiding the outcome and restoring equilibrium to the day's carefully navigated events.